At the Chilean naval base at Talcahuano, on the central coast of Chile, there is a warship that has been in continuous commission since 1866, and that has never, in more than 150 years, left Chilean territorial waters. She is not a warship in any operational sense. She has not fired her guns in anger since 1879. She has not moved under her own power in decades. She sits in the harbor at Talcahuano in the precise condition of a ship that has been preserved as a monument rather than maintained as a weapon, her hull painted in the colors she wore in her last battle, her guns cleaned and oiled in their original mountings, her interior maintained as a museum that receives tens of thousands of visitors per year. She is the BOP Huáscar, the Peruvian ironclad that became the Chilean ironclad that became the most contested artifact of a contested war. She is the only surviving example of a mid-19th century turret ironclad in the world. She is a sacred site for Peru, which regards her as a symbol of national heroism and sacrifice. She is a trophy of war for Chile, which regards her as a symbol of naval supremacy and the skill of the officers who captured her. She is, technically and formally, still a commissioned ship of the Chilean Navy, carrying the designation bow number AB11 and flying the Chilean naval ensign, a warship on continuous active service for a century and a half, the oldest commissioned warship in the world after HMS Victory. She is also the physical record of one of the most remarkable careers in the history of 19th century naval warfare, a career that included service in 2 navies, participation in a failed revolution, the sinking of a corvette by deliberate ram attack, the humiliation of the most powerful British warship in the Pacific, and a final battle against an overwhelming force that produced in defeat a legend more durable than any victory could have provided. The Huáscar was built by the Laird Brothers shipyard at Birkenhead, England, completed in 1866, and commissioned into the Peruvian Navy as one of 2 modern ironclad warships that Peru had ordered from British yards as part of a naval modernization program that reflected the specific anxieties of South American naval competition in the mid-19th century. She was a turret ship, meaning that her primary armament was housed in a rotating armored turret rather than in the conventional broadside casemate arrangement, and she was therefore a vessel at the technological frontier of her era, embodying the specific approach to ironclad design that Cowper Phipps Coles had been advocating in Britain and that the Battle of Hampton Roads had made seem like the future. Her specifications reflected the ambitions of her designers and the constraints of the Peruvian naval budget. She displaced approximately 1,870 tons, a moderate size for an ironclad of the period. She measured approximately 60 meters in length, with a beam of 10.7 meters. Her 2-cylinder horizontal return connecting rod steam engines produced approximately 1,500 indicated horsepower through a single propeller, giving her a maximum speed of approximately 12.5 knots, which was adequate for the operational requirements of the South American Pacific coast, but not exceptional by the standards of contemporary European naval design. Her armor was iron plate, 4.5 inches thick on the turret and 2.5 inches on the hull sides, light by the standards of the heavily armored capital ships being built in European yards, but adequate against the weapons she was likely to encounter in her operational area. The turret itself, positioned amidships and capable of rotating to cover arcs on both sides of the ship, housed 2 10-inch Armstrong guns that could fire shells weighing approximately 115 kilograms. These were the largest naval guns in South American waters at the time of her commissioning and remained among the most powerful weapons afloat in the Pacific for the decade following her completion. The combination of the turret arrangement, which allowed the guns to fire in any direction without the ship needing to maneuver, and the power of the 10-inch Armstrong pieces made the Huáscar an opponent that no warship in the Pacific navies of Chile, Bolivia, or Ecuador could engage on equal terms. She also carried a projecting ram bow of the type that had become standard following the Battle of Lissa in 1866, and she would use this ram in combat in ways that the doctrine derived from Lissa had predicted, though, as with virtually every post-Lissa ram attempt, the specific conditions required for success were not straightforwardly reproducible. The first decade of the Huáscar's service in Peruvian waters was not distinguished by combat. She performed the routine functions of the most powerful warship in the Peruvian fleet, showing the flag, maintaining Peru's coastal and oceanic presence, and deterring the kind of interference from neighboring powers and European commercial interests that a capable warship could deter by simply being present and demonstrably able to fight. The South American Pacific coast in the 1860s and 70s was an environment in which the presence of an ironclad turret ship with 10-inch guns communicated a diplomatic message that smaller vessels and shore fortifications could not replicate. The first episode that brought the Huáscar to international attention was not a battle against a foreign enemy, but a rebellion against the Peruvian government itself. In May of 1877, a Peruvian naval officer named Nicolás de Pierola led a revolt against the government of President Mariano Ignacio Prado, seizing the Huáscar and the corvette Union and using them to conduct operations along the Peruvian coast in support of his political cause. Pierola's use of the Huáscar for what amounted to commerce raiding against ships supplying the government he opposed brought him into conflict not only with the Peruvian government, but with the British commercial interests whose ships he had interfered with. The British response was the deployment of two Royal Navy warships, HMS Shah and HMS Amethyst, to intercept the rebel Huáscar and compel her to stop interfering with British commerce. The encounter on May 29, 1877, between the British warships and the Huáscar is one of the more extraordinary episodes in the history of the Victorian Navy. The Shah was a first-class armoured cruiser of 4,500 tons, significantly larger than the Huáscar, armed with 16 guns of various calibers and representing the most powerful British warship in the Pacific. The encounter lasted approximately 3 hours. The Shah fired approximately 277 rounds at the Huáscar. The Huáscar was hit approximately 70 times by shells that the iron armor largely deflected or absorbed without penetrating to the critical spaces below the waterline. The Huáscar fired back with her two 10-inch guns and her secondary armament, hitting the Shah several times without causing decisive damage. The Shah fired a torpedo at the Huáscar, the first offensive use of the Whitehead torpedo in naval combat, but the Huáscar avoided it by maneuvering. The engagement ended without either ship sinking the other, and Pierola eventually submitted to the Peruvian government, and the rebellion ended without the battle having decided anything militarily. The engagement was significant, primarily for what it demonstrated about the Huáscar's fighting capability. A single mid-sized turret ironclad had fought one of the Royal Navy's principal Pacific warships to a standstill without being sunk, absorbing a volume of fire that would have destroyed any unarmored vessel and emerging with her fighting capability essentially intact. The Peruvian newspapers, which had been following the rebellion with intense interest, interpreted the Huáscar's survival as a demonstration of her invulnerability that somewhat exceeded what the facts strictly supported. The British newspapers drew different conclusions, focusing on the inadequacy of the Shah's unarmored hull against even the modest return fire of the Huáscar. The encounter against HMS Shah established the Huáscar's reputation in the public consciousness of Peru and Chile alike, and when the War of the Pacific began in February of 1879, both sides were fully aware of the Huáscar's capabilities. The War of the Pacific, which involved Chile on one side and the allied nations of Peru and Bolivia on the other, was a conflict over the nitrate-rich territories of the Atacama Desert and the specific treaty arrangements that governed their exploitation. The war would prove to be one of the most consequential conflicts in South American history, reshaping the borders of 3 nations and establishing Chilean dominance of the Pacific coast for a generation. The naval phase of the war was critical because the land armies depended on sea supply, and control of the sea lanes between the combatants' ports and the disputed territories would determine which side could sustain its ground forces in the field. The Chilean Navy, which had 2 armored warships of its own, the Cochrane, and the Blanco Encalada, was broadly competitive with the Peruvian Navy, but the Huáscar's fighting record and reputation made her the central concern of Chilean naval planning. Captain Miguel Grau Seminario was given command of the Huáscar at the outbreak of the war, and what followed over the next 6 months became the substance of a national legend that has not diminished in the century and a half since. Grau was 43 years old, born in Piura in northern Peru, and he had served in the Peruvian Navy since the age of 14, accumulating a career that included service on American and European vessels and a deep familiarity with the strategic and tactical requirements of naval warfare in the South American Pacific. He was, by the assessment of everyone who observed him, an officer of unusual capability and personal character, and the qualities he brought to command of the Huáscar during the 6 months he held that command defined both the tactical record of the ship and the moral character of the legend that her eventual loss created. Grau's campaign with the Huáscar from the outbreak of the war in February to his death in October of 1879 was a sustained commerce raiding and harassment operation against Chilean shipping and coastal installations that required him to keep his ship operational against the active opposition of the Chilean Navy and without the ability to use any port for extended maintenance or provisioning. He captured Chilean vessels, released their crews in the specific manner that had made his predecessors at Lissa and von Müller at the Emden famous for courtesy to prisoners, intercepted Chilean supply ships, bombarded Chilean coastal positions, and kept the Chilean Naval Command in a state of continuous anxiety about where the Huáscar would appear next and what she would do when she got there. The incident that most clearly illustrated both Grau's tactical boldness and his personal character was the engagement with the Chilean corvette Esmeralda at Iquique on May 21, 1879. The Esmeralda was an unarmored wooden corvette that had been blockading the Peruvian port of Iquique along with the gunboat Covadonga when the Huáscar and the Union arrived to break the blockade. The disparity in the engagement was absolute. The Esmeralda had no weapon capable of penetrating the Huáscar's armor at any range, and the Huáscar's 10-inch guns could destroy the unarmored corvette with a single accurate hit. Captain Arturo Prat of the Esmeralda recognized that his ship could not fight the Huáscar on any terms that offered survival, but he refused to surrender or to flee. He kept the Esmeralda fighting, maneuvering to avoid the Huáscar's fire, and returning it with guns that the Huáscar's armor was absorbing without serious effect. The Huáscar rammed the Esmeralda twice. On the second ramming, Prat leaped from the Esmeralda's deck onto the Huáscar's hull as the ships came together, apparently intending to board the enemy vessel. He was shot and killed almost immediately. The Esmeralda sank, most of her crew dying with her. The significance of Iquique in the history of the War of the Pacific lies not in the military outcome, which was never in doubt, but in the moral status that both sides conferred on the participants after the battle. Arturo Prat became the defining hero of Chilean naval history. His leap onto the Huáscar's hull transformed into a gesture of such defiant courage that it created a mythology around his name and around the battle that Chilean naval culture has maintained with remarkable intensity to the present day. Every Chilean naval officer recites his memory. Every Chilean warship since has carried a crew that knows his name and the circumstances of his death. Miguel Grau, for his part, behaved after the battle in a manner that complicated the simple enemy-villain role that Chilean wartime propaganda might have wished to assign him. He recovered Prat's body from the water and treated it with full military honors. He wrote a personal letter of condolence to Prat's widow, enclosing her husband's personal possessions that had been recovered. The gesture was received in Chile with a combination of admiration and discomfort that reflects the complexity of Grau's status. He was the commander of an enemy vessel that had sunk a Chilean hero, and he had done so with a personal decency that made it impossible to hate him cleanly. Grau was killed on October 8, 1879, at the Battle of Angamos, when the Huáscar was finally caught by the Chilean ironclads Cochrane and Blanco Encalada, along with several other Chilean warships, off the headland of Punta Angamos on the Antofagasta coast. The Chilean ships had spent months attempting to corner the Huáscar, and the intelligence that allowed them to predict her position on October 8th came from their interception of communications that revealed her planned route. The Huáscar was caught between two Chilean ironclads, unable to run because the Cochrane was approximately equal in speed and the Blanco Encalada had cut off her escape route to the north. The battle lasted approximately 2 hours. The Chilean ironclads fired on the Huáscar with 8-inch guns that were capable of penetrating her armor at battle ranges, and several hits struck the turret, disabling the mechanism that rotated it and leaving the Huáscar's main battery unable to train on the Chilean ships. A shell struck the conning tower, killing Grau and the officers with him. Command passed successively to junior officers as the Chilean fire continued to kill the Huáscar's leadership, and the surviving officers eventually decided to scuttle the ship rather than allow her capture, opening the sea cocks and attempting to flood the ship. The Chilean boarding party, which had been approaching as the battle wound down, reached the Huáscar before the flooding was complete and was able to stop it, saving the ship. Grau's body was not recovered from the conning tower. The Huáscar's captain had died at his post, and his physical remains were lost with the battle. The Chilean officers who boarded the Huáscar found his personal effects and treated them with the respect that his record warranted. They were returned to his family in Peru. The reciprocity was noted on both sides of the conflict and has contributed to the specific quality of the Huáscar's status as a shared monument between two nations that fought a bitter war. The Chilean Navy commissioned the Huáscar into service under its own flag, and she served as a Chilean warship for several decades following her capture, participating in the subsequent naval operations of the War of the Pacific, and later in Chilean internal conflicts. Her fighting career under Chilean colors was not as dramatic as her Peruvian service, reflecting both the altered strategic situation after the war's conclusion and the progressive obsolescence of her design as newer warships entered service. But she continued to carry the Chilean flag and to serve in various auxiliary and training capacities into the early 20th century, maintaining the formal status of a commissioned warship throughout. The decision to preserve the Huáscar rather than scrap her when she became obsolescent was made in the early 20th century and has been maintained and reaffirmed by successive Chilean governments and naval authorities ever since. She was placed in permanent berth at Talcahuano, her hull repaired and her interior restored to approximate her condition at the Battle of Angamos, and she was opened as a museum ship. The maintenance of her formal commissioned status, which gives her the distinction of being the oldest commissioned warship in the world after HMS Victory, reflects both the Chilean Navy's recognition of her historical significance and the specific character of her status as a trophy of war, whose capture is regarded as a defining moment of Chilean naval history. The museum that she contains is, by the standards of naval preservation anywhere in the world, unusually comprehensive. The turret with its two 10-inch Armstrong guns is preserved in the position it occupied after the battle, one gun trained to starboard and one to port, the elevation and training mechanisms intact if no longer functional. The conning tower where Grau died is preserved and accessible to visitors. The physical space where the most celebrated death in Peruvian naval history occurred, presented without theatrical elaboration, but with a specificity that makes the event real in a way that a painted replica or a model could not. The crew spaces below decks, the engine room, the magazine, the officers' quarters, all are maintained in a condition that reflects the ship's active service life rather than the static perfection of an exhibit. The Huáscar's status in Peru is the mirror image of her status in Chile, with the emotional weight shifted in the direction of mourning rather than triumph. She is regarded in Peru as a sacred vessel of national sacrifice, the ship in which the most celebrated officer in Peruvian naval history died fighting against overwhelming odds. Miguel Grau is the preeminent naval hero of Peru, remembered not only for his tactical skill and his sustained campaign with the Huáscar, but for the specific moral quality of his conduct toward prisoners and defeated enemies, which distinguished him in a war that produced more than its share of ruthlessness on both sides. The Huáscar's location in Chilean, rather than Peruvian hands, is a source of a specific and unresolved national grief that has not diminished with the passage of time. The diplomatic and cultural relationship between Peru and Chile over the Huáscar has been complex and occasionally contentious. Peru has at various times expressed the wish to have the ship returned, and Chile has declined. The matter has been managed through a series of understandings and protocols rather than through a formal resolution, and both countries have arrived at an accommodation in which Peruvian naval vessels visiting Talcahuano render honors to the Huáscar. Peruvian officials are permitted to visit and maintain a connection to the ship, and the ship herself is maintained in a condition that treats her as the shared heritage of both nations' naval history, which she is, rather than as the exclusive property of the victor, which she is also. The October 8th anniversary of the Battle of Angamos is the day on which the Chilean Navy celebrates its most important commemorative event, Navy Day, the annual recognition of the naval heritage of the institution. Every officer and sailor in the Chilean fleet knows what happened at Angamos and what the Huáscar represents in the history of their service. The Peruvian Navy has its own observance of the same date, marking it as the anniversary of Grau's death and honoring his memory in the manner that a national hero receives when the nation whose history he embodies has the specific character that Peru brings to its military commemoration. The Huáscar is the only surviving turret ironclad in the world, a fact whose significance for the history of naval technology is independent of the national and emotional significance that her particular career has accumulated. The turret ship type, introduced in the 1860s and representing a specific approach to the problem of mounting heavy guns in armored protection while retaining the ability to engage targets in any direction, was superseded within a few decades by the barbette, and then the fully enclosed turret arrangements that characterized the pre-dreadnought and dreadnought battleship. The design philosophy that produced the Huáscar was a technological moment, a transitional approach between the broadside ironclad and the fully turreted capital ship, and the Huáscar is the physical record of that moment. No other vessel of her type survives in any museum or archive in the world. The condition of the preservation is, by the standard of wooden museum ships that have been maintained for comparable periods, remarkably good. The iron hull that has endured a century and a half in the salt air and salt water of the Chilean Pacific coast shows the effects of that exposure in ways that the ongoing maintenance effort works to contain, but the structural integrity of the ship is maintained, and the essential systems that defined her fighting capability are present and comprehensible to the visitor who knows what to look for. The turret rotates. The guns are in their original mountings. The armor is the armor that the 10-inch shells of the Chilean Cochrane struck and penetrated at Angamos. She has been there since 1879, since the Chilean boarding party stopped the flooding and brought her into port as the most significant prize the Chilean Navy had ever taken. She has flown the Chilean flag continuously. She has been formally commissioned as a Chilean warship continuously. She has never left Chilean waters. The crew that boarded her at Angamos is long gone. The officers who commanded her in the final decades of her active service are long gone. The political leaders who decided to preserve rather than scrap her are long gone. The warships that were her contemporaries, the Chilean Cochrane and Blanco Encalada that defeated her, the Peruvian Union that served with her, the British Shah that fought her to a standstill in the rebellion of 1877, are all gone, their steel long since reduced to the scrap metal that the Huáscar's preservation specifically avoided. She remains because both nations needed her to remain, though for different reasons, and the specific combination of Chilean national pride in her capture and Peruvian national reverence for the man who died in her produced an outcome that the practical economics of warship disposal would not have produced on their own. Old warships are expensive to maintain and occupy valuable harbor space and represent no operational capability. The reasons to preserve them are almost entirely non-material having to do with memory and identity, and the specific human need to have physical objects that anchor historical meaning in ways that documents and photographs and models cannot quite replicate. The Huáscar is that object for both nations that fought over her, and she is that object for the history of naval technology, and she is that object for anyone who stands on her deck and looks at the turret with its two 10-inch guns and tries to understand what it meant to fight in a vessel of this size and capability in the waters of the South American Pacific in 1879, with the Chilean ironclads closing from both sides and the captain dying in the conning tower and the junior officers deciding whether to scuttle or surrender, and the Chilean boarding party arriving before the flooding was complete. She is 158 years old. She is still in commission. She flies the Chilean flag. Miguel Grau's ghost is in the conning tower. If ghosts inhabit the places where their possessors died with their work unfinished and their cause defeated, and their personal conduct so far above what the circumstances demanded that even their enemies honored them for it, Peru calls her their Caballero de los Mares, the Knight of the Seas. The ship is Chilean. The knight was Peruvian. Both claims are true, and neither is complete without the other.